Alright, y'all. So Robert Reich, love him or hate him, has some awesome things to say about the income and wealth inequality here in the United States. He released a video a couple years back, and I think it's important now more than ever to amplify this message. So we'll watch it and break it down as we go. Before we do that, I want to give a disclaimer. This should not be a partisan issue. Progressives, liberals, moderates, conservatives, MAGA, the whole spectrum, everyone should be in agreement that this massive transfer of wealth from the bottom half of America to the top 1% that's taken place over the last 4 or 5 decades is the main culprit for our massive unhoused population, for our wages being stagnant for over 30 years, and for several other foundational problems that I'll be talking about in this video and in other videos. People of all types of political persuasions should be in agreement that this is a major issue and that we can and should do something about it. At the end of this video, Robert talks about all of the ways that we can combat this.
Elon Musk's wealth has surpassed $200 billion. It would take the median U.S. worker over 4 million years to make that much.
The crazy thing is, Elon Musk's wealth has actually doubled since this video was released 3 years ago. And his wealth has increased by $84 billion. $84 billion since Trump got elected this past November. I'm putting the link to the studies that prove that in the description of this video.
Wealth inequality is eating this country alive. We're now in America's second Gilded Age, just like the late 19th century, when a handful of robber barons monopolized the economy, kept wages down, and bribed lawmakers. While today's robber barons take joyrides into space, the distance between their gargantuan wealth and the financial struggles of working Americans has never been clearer. During the first 19 months of the pandemic, U.S. billionaires added $2.1 trillion to their collective wealth, and the rich have enough political power to cut their taxes to almost nothing, sometimes literally nothing. In fact, Jeff Bezos paid no federal income taxes in 2007 or in 2011. By 2018, the 400 richest Americans paid a lower overall tax rate than almost anyone else.
Just to clarify, the title of this graph is Billionaires Pay Lower Taxes Than the Working Class. However, some billionaires do pay more in total in income tax, but their tax rates are lower than many middle class and working class Americans, which is not fair at all, and is the result of decades of rigging tax law to create loopholes. And in some cases, it's rigged so much in their favor that they can avoid paying any income tax at all, like Robert mentioned.
But we can't solve this problem unless we know how it was created in the first place. Let's start with the basics. Wealth inequality in America is far larger than income inequality. Income is what you earn each week or month or year. Wealth refers to the sum total of your assets. Your car, your home, art, anything else you own that's valuable. Valuable not only because there's a market for it, a price other people are willing to pay to buy it, but because wealth itself grows. As the population expands and the nation becomes more productive, the overall economy continues to expand. This expansion pushes up the values of stocks, bonds, rental property, homes, and most other assets. Of course, recessions and occasional depressions can reduce the value of such assets, but over the long haul, the value of almost all wealth increases. Next, personal wealth comes from two sources. The first source is the income you earn but don't spend. That's your savings. When you invest those savings in stocks, bonds, or real property or other assets, you create your personal wealth, which, as we've seen, grows over time. The second source of personal wealth is whatever is handed down to you from your parents, grandparents, and maybe even generations before them. In other words, what you inherit. The wealth gap between the richest Americans and everyone else is staggering.
This is basically the crux of the issue right here.
In the 1970s, the wealthiest 1% owned about 20% of the nation's total household wealth. Now, they own over 35%. Much of their gains over the last 40 years have come from a dramatic increase in the value of shares of stock. For example, if someone invested $1,000 in 1978 in a broad index of stocks, say the S&P 500, they would have $31,823 today, adjusted for inflation. Who's benefited from this surge? The richest 1%, who now own half the entire stock market.
So the top 1% of the richest people in America own half of the stock market? This video is a couple years old, so understand that this gap is much wider now.
The typical worker's wages have barely grown. Most Americans haven't earned nearly enough to save anything.
This is a vital piece of the puzzle. Wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. Wages adjusted for inflation have stayed the same, while cost of living and everyday goods have multiplied since. I mean, think about it. Back then, in the early 1970s, gas cost 50 cents, 60 cents a gallon. A new car was $4,000, maybe $5,000. Slowly over the last 50 years, inflation has caused goods to cost slightly more each year. The problem is that wages have not kept up with that inflation. Things are too expensive for most people because of this.
Before the pandemic, when the economy appeared to be doing well, almost 80% were living paycheck to paycheck.
I've seen several studies show different figures for this. Of course, the outcomes change based on the population of the study, but some studies say that as low as 50% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, while other studies, like this one, show that nearly 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. However, I usually say 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck because it's the average of the major studies on it.
So as income inequality has widened, the amount that the few high-earning households save, their wealth, has continued to grow. Their growing wealth has allowed them to pass on more and more wealth to their heirs. Take, for example, the Waltons, the family behind the Walmart empire, which has 7 heirs on the Forbes billionaires list. Their children and other rich millennials will soon consolidate even more of the nation's wealth. America is now on the cusp of the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. As wealthy boomers pass on, somewhere between $30 to $70 trillion will go to their children over the next 3 decades. These children will be able to live off this wealth and then leave the bulk of it, which will continue growing, to their own children, tax-free. After a few generations of this, almost all of America's wealth could be in the hands of a few thousand families. Concentrated wealth is already endangering our democracy.
At the beginning of this video, I said that the massive transfer of wealth from the bottom half of America to the top 1% is the major reason why we have so many foundational issues. Robert is about to give some great insight as to why the wealthiest 1% having a large concentration of the wealth in this country is a huge problem.
Wealth doesn't just beget more wealth, it begets more power. Dynastic wealth concentrates power in the hands of fewer and fewer people who can choose what nonprofits and charities to support and which politicians to bankroll. This gives an unelected elite enormous sway over both our economy and our democracy. We might come to resemble the kind of dynasties common to European aristocracies in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Dynastic wealth makes a mockery of the idea that America is a meritocracy where anyone can make it on the basis of their own efforts. It also runs counter to the basic economic ideas that people earn what they're worth in the market and that economic gains should go to those who deserve them. Finally, wealth concentration magnifies gender and race disparities because women and people of color tend to make less, save less, and inherit less. The typical single woman owns only 32 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth owned by a man. The pandemic likely increased this gap. The racial wealth gap is even starker. The typical black household owns just 13 cents of wealth for every dollar of wealth owned by the typical white household. The pandemic likely increased this gap too. In all these ways, dynastic wealth creates a self-perpetuating aristocracy that runs counter to the ideals we claim to live by. The last time America faced anything comparable to the concentration of wealth we face today was at the turn of the 20th century. That was when President Teddy Roosevelt warned that, quote, a small class of enormously wealthy and economically powerful men whose chief object is to hold and increase their power, unquote, could destroy American democracy. Roosevelt's answer then was to tax wealth. Congress enacted two kinds of wealth taxes. The first, in 1916, was the estate tax, a tax on the wealth someone has accumulated during their lifetime, paid by the heirs who inherit that wealth. The second tax on wealth, enacted in 1922, was a capital gains tax, a tax on the increased value of those assets paid when those assets are sold. But both of these wealth taxes have shrunk since then, or become so riddled with loopholes that they haven't been able to prevent a new American aristocracy from emerging. The Trump Republican tax cut enabled individuals to exclude $11.18 million from their estate taxes. That means one couple can pass on more than $22 million to their kids tax-free. Not to mention the very rich often find ways around this tax entirely.
If this number is true, that the wealthiest have found loopholes to evade paying their fair share of taxes, which totals $163 billion a year, over 6 years, that's almost $1 trillion. Do you know what we could do with $1 trillion? Do you know what we could fund? We could ensure that nobody goes hungry. Everyone could get an education at an affordable price. We could start to implement a single-payer healthcare system, or make our current system more affordable. Homelessness would be at a fraction of what it is now. We could start to fund a high-speed rail system to ensure that Americans can get efficiently from city to city, and even more importantly, we could improve public transportation infrastructure in every city. The possibilities would be endless.
The biggest loophole is something called the stepped-up basis. If the wealthy hold on to their assets until they die, their heirs inherit them without paying any capital gains taxes whatsoever. All the increased value of those assets is simply erased for tax purposes. This loophole saves heirs an estimated $40 billion a year. This means that huge accumulations of wealth in the hands of a relatively few households can be passed from generation to generation untaxed, growing along the way, generating comfortable incomes for rich descendants who will never have to work a day of their lives. That's the dynastic class we're creating right now. Why have these two wealth taxes eroded? Because as America's wealth has concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, the wealthy have more capacity to donate to political campaigns and public relations. And they've used that political power to reduce their taxes. It's exactly what Teddy Roosevelt feared so many years ago.
It's the most obvious thing to me that there's this snowball effect happening where the rich are getting richer and are therefore able to fund and to buy politicians to help them rig tax law in their favor to continue to protect their wealth that keeps growing and growing. Now here is the call to action. Here's how we can reduce the wealth gap.
So what do we do? follow the wisdom of Teddy Roosevelt and tax great accumulations of wealth. The ultra-rich have benefited from the American system, from laws that protect their wealth, and our economy that enabled them to build their fortunes in the first place. They should pay their fair share. The majority of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, believe the ultra-rich should pay higher taxes. There are many ways to make them do so: closing the stepped-up basis loophole, raising the capital gains tax, and fully funding the Internal Revenue Service so it can properly audit the wealthiest taxpayers. For starters, beyond those fixes, we need a new wealth tax, a tax of just 2% a year on wealth in excess of $1 million. It's hardly a drop in the bucket for centibillionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but it would generate plenty of revenue to invest in healthcare and education so that millions of Americans have a fair shot at making it. One of the most important things you as an individual can do is take the time to understand the realities of wealth inequality in America and how the system has become rigged in favor of those at the top, and demand your political representatives take action to unrig it. Wealth inequality is worse than it has been in a century. We have to stop this vicious cycle and demand an economy that works for the many, not one that concentrates more and more wealth in the hands of a privileged few.
Here is my contribution to the conversation. I've seen several studies that have shown if the concentration of wealth today in America was the same that it was in 1960, when it was spread more evenly amongst the classes, then today every American would have an extra $1,100 in their paychecks every month, because wages would have gone up with inflation and the cost of living. Imagine that. If every American, that 78% of America who live paycheck to paycheck, had an extra $1,100 every month, that would single-handedly bring millions out of poverty. I'll try to find the study that concluded this and put a link to it in the description of this video. In my opinion, Robert does a masterful job here at explaining that over the last several decades, the concentration of wealth from the bottom half of America, the working class, the middle class, to the top 1% includes trillions of dollars. And like I said, if the balance of wealth today was the same that it was just a few decades ago, we would have a fraction of the problems that we have. Healthcare and housing are too expensive. Most Americans don't make enough to be able to save for the future or to make an emergency fund. And this situation was mostly caused by wages not keeping up with inflation and the cost of living. The main point here is that the blame goes to the multimillionaires and billionaires who continue to buy our elected officials to rig the tax laws in their favor. And by extension, the lawmakers who have been bought by big money interests and lobbyists are also to blame. I agree with all of the tax policy that Robert mentioned at the end of the video. If the wealthy paid their fair share, it would allow us to invest in healthcare, education, increasing the social safety net. We have upwards of 78% of America living paycheck to paycheck. Many of those military veterans. This needs to happen. These changes need to happen. If you stuck around to the end of this video, thank you, you're a legend. Now, if you wouldn't mind liking the video and leaving a comment so that the spooky YouTube algorithm will give me some aura points, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.